The letter from September 9, 1791 reads, "We have agreed that the federal district shall be called the Territory of Columbia, and the federal city, the City of Washington." The recipient was not their patron, President George Washington, but a French-born architect whose ego would lead to his most memorable triumph and his professional undoing. Welcome to American Esoterica. If history class gives you the autocorrect, this is the ducking shin. The essential stuff in between. The personalities, events, and other ephemera that shape our history and culture. I'm Brian Powers. In the Residence Act of 1790, Congress gave President Washington the honor of selecting a site for the federal city on the Potomac, and he appointed 3 commissioners, Daniel Carroll, Thomas Johnson, and David Stewart, to survey the area and find the most suitable spot for the new capital. They met in the nearby town of Georgetown, where they decided on the name of the capital city in the district where it would reside, and they were to oversee the man chosen by Washington to lay out the plan for the federal city, French architect Pierre L'Enfant. It was this choice which gave us Washington, D.C. as we know it, but it also nearly threw the entire project into chaos. Because we can't just start with everyone being on the same page. The history of Washington, D.C. is replete with internal conflict. The site alone nearly divided our fledgling nation irrevocably, and even once a compromise emerged, there were still competing ideas of what the capital city should be. Thomas Jefferson, no slouch himself in the architecture department, envisioned a small, austere city without pretense, a refreshing antidote to the grandiose European capitals. On the opposite end of the spectrum lay our friend Pierre, who proposed a grand design that won over President Washington and others immediately. He got the job. And when Congress finally got done deciding on where to stick it, both Washington and L'Enfant got to work eagerly. Now, when I say that first president of the United States, George Washington, got to work eagerly, I don't mean he read reports from L'Enfant and the commissioners and made decisions. I mean, he went down to the chosen site, met with every single landowner in the proposed district, haggled with them all personally, and sealed the land deals with them at Souter's Tavern in Georgetown over the course of a few evenings in March of 1791, followed by maybe a celebratory beer or two. No eminent domain required. The United States worked out a deal with the landowners and bought all that was necessary to create the federal city. He even swung through again later to personally answer complaints from those who had rethought the bargain. How invested was Washington? He personally staked out the spot for the White House's north walls and entrance. When the plan for the city was released and the sale of plots was open to the public, Washington snapped up a few for himself. Even after he left the presidency in 1797, Washington continued to keep tabs on the progress, or lack thereof, of the new city, keeping close contact with his chosen commissioners. But in the early days of planning, Washington met with his team at Souter's Tavern. That would include L'Enfant, the commissioners, Andrew Ellicott, the premier surveyor of his day, and some others. In this small tavern, the federal city took shape as the men met, argued, revised, compared notes, and designed a grand capital. Again, it's befitting the city and, frankly, the country, that it got sketched out basically in the back of a bar. L'Enfant had a dream team of surveyors, architects, and planners, such as Benjamin Banneker, a free black surveyor and mathematician, and Alexander Ralston, a renowned urban designer. And L'Enfant's vision slowly took shape. On June 22, 1791, L'Enfant presented his first plan for the city to Washington. It was indeed a grand vision. The streets were largely laid out in a grid pattern, but major avenues cut across the grid at a diagonal, radiating out from the centers of government. So anyone going about their business on regular city streets would cross these avenues and suddenly get a reminder glimpse of the reason the city existed, with the grand government buildings anchoring these diagonal avenues. The street scheme was similar to Paris, which itself was similar to Rome, which itself was patterned after Athens. But let's go back to Rome for a second. Because the center of all political life in Rome was at the top of the smallest of the famed 7 hills of Rome, and streets radiated out from it. L'Enfant designed what he called Congress House in the same fashion. The building housing the nation's legislature would sit atop Jenkins's Hill, the largest hill in the district, and major thoroughfares would radiate out from it like spokes. The president's house would be at the end of such a spoke, Pennsylvania Avenue. One architect in particular inspired L'Enfant, a late Renaissance designer named Domenico Fontana, who had a heavy hand in Roman architecture in the 16th century. Fontana also really liked Egyptian obelisks, such as the 327-ton one he erected in St. Peter's Square. So, classical Roman architecture, giant obelisks, this is all starting to sound familiar, right? But why Rome? Or Greece for that matter? If you indulge me a 25-year-old lesson from a long-forgotten political science professor, the answer is simple. Our architecture reflects our political philosophy. The Greeks invented democracy, which gave the people the right to a say in their government. The Romans employed similar ideas during their empire years, but it was the Renaissance that brought forth a new ideal: civic republicanism. This was the idea that there is both good in individual freedom and a duty to secure the common good for everyone. It is undergirded by the notion that everyone has a civic duty to participate in political life, even if just through informed voting. What better way to reinforce the civic virtue of political participation within individual lives than by having those individuals come across views of government buildings crossing their path as they live their lives across the town? What better way to remind them of the classical underpinnings of the philosophy that gave them freedom and influenced the founders than by constructing great buildings that pay homage to the origins of those philosophies? You can take this analysis too far, but it still mostly holds up. The parallels are there. That smallest hill in Rome, the one that became the center of all political life in the city, it was called Capitoline Hill. And that's where we get the word capital, such as the center of all political life in Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill. It's also more amusing to note what a hodgepodge of styles our Capitol building is. Really, it's a Roman temple in the middle, flanked by two Greek temples, and just for kicks, they stuck a completely out-of-place dome of the English Baroque style on top as an afterthought. Seriously, go do an image search for St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and you'll see what I mean. The plan also called for 15 squares throughout the city for each then-admitted state to decorate as a matter of state pride. Since these squares would be connected by line-of-sight avenues, they would inspire healthy competition to see which state could top the others in its view. L'Enfant had his vision for the federal city, and he was determined to put it into place. All of it, every bit of it, without one deviation. And then the murders began. No, but it did get rough. It was L'Enfant's ego that started to wear on the commissioners. He insisted he had a plan for both the Congress House and the President's House, and he had gone so far as to get leases with some quarries to supply the stone for the foundations. The commissioners were not particularly happy with this, since they were supposed to be overseeing the construction of the buildings and the budgeting as such. L'Enfant often either just ignored them entirely or went directly to Washington with questions. Technically, the commissioners were his bosses on the project, though, and he was about to get on their last nerve. One of the property owners that had agreed to sell substantial portions of property to the government to build the federal city happened to be Daniel Carroll, who was the nephew of the commissioner by the same name. Carroll owned a sizable chunk of Jenkins's Hill, and he had already started building on land in the district. In fact, he had started the building right where L'Enfant proposed to put a street. George Washington received a letter from L'Enfant explaining the situation of the property owner blocking a proposed street. He also got another letter that same day from one Daniel Carroll, angry at the fact that L'Enfant had just started tearing the new building down himself. Washington pleaded with L'Enfant, saying, "Look, dude, this guy was already building this thing before we designed the city. Leave him the heck alone." I'm paraphrasing here. But L'Enfant did not. He ordered the house be fully torn down. Again, Washington politely responded that this would be a bad idea, also noting that L'Enfant should really be dealing with the commissioners and not him. So L'Enfant lied to the commissioners instead, telling them that he understood the issue and we would work out some sort of deal and everything would be okay. The commissioners happily wrote to George Washington, and all was quiet for 2 weeks until they realized that L'Enfant was secretly placating them while plotting the final destruction of the offending house. Oh, and also another one down the street. Meanwhile, Andrew Ellicott, the surveyor, was becoming increasingly frustrated with L'Enfant as well. L'Enfant wouldn't commit to a final set of plans and get them engraved to make copies, so Ellicott decided to make his own revisions, which infuriated the Frenchman. L'Enfant's ego was getting the better of him, and his insistence upon going it alone finally wore out Washington's patience. L'Enfant by name, l'Enfant by nature. He wrote to Washington out of frustration and threatened to quit if everyone didn't stop meddling in him doing whatever it was that he wanted to do, which Washington decided was as good an out as any and accepted L'Enfant's fake resignation. He out and out fired him. Ellicott's plans became the primary design, even though they were only variations of L'Enfant's ideas. And thus the federal city came to be, free from the further influence of L'Enfant. Or so we thought. This has been American Esoterica. All sounds were made by me, Brian Powers. Did I get it wrong? Did I get it right? Just want to talk about how you already knew that L'Enfant is French for the child? Drop me a note. The address is yell@americanesoterica.com. More information on the show and its episodes can be found at americanesoterica.com. Thank you for listening, and God bless America.